I actually want to talk about the topic of differential susceptibility to environmental influences, the case of fathers and fathering question mark, because there's not much work in that area, but I want to talk about several other things too. And I want to begin by saying that, for me, coming to a conference on fathering in 2015 is kind of deja vu all over again. 40 years ago, I did my PhD dissertation on mothers and fathers and infants. I followed very closely in the footsteps of Michael Lamb, who really launched that focus. And it's been going on for 40 years, and I think what you see here is some of the great results of those intellectual investments. I have to say, though, I'm always frustrated when I get manuscripts to review, and people say that, at least in the research world, fathers are neglected. 40 years ago, you could have said that, and Michael Lamb said it. 30 years ago, you might have been able to get away with saying it. 20 years ago, it didn't. But still, I still get papers that say it. So we've been studying fathers for a long time these days. They're still neglected, relatively speaking, to mothers, but the literature is voluminous. I want to raise three ideas, because I want to challenge some core notions. And I'm not going to disagree with Gary, but I want to qualify at least one part of what he said, and I suspect he'll agree with me in this qualification. And that is, to begin with, well, there's plenty of evidence out there that men are good for children, and their involvement in children's development is good, as Gary pointed out, in a diverse realm of outcomes, whether it's social or emotional, cognitive or school achievement, the quality of their own relationships with their mates, etc., their capacity to parent when they grow up. They're not an unmitigated good. And I think this is important because, quite frankly, I tire of hearing policy responses that make it sound like every father, if you would, is a saint. And especially, I get unnerved when I see courts granting fathers who've never been involved with their children half-time because men should be involved with their fathers. I'm a great believer that when courts make deliberations about custody decisions, they should take into account what's the history of this child with these two parents, and not be so ideological about it. But there are places, there are states, there are counties, there are places in the world where it's become a very ideological issue, almost irrespective of the kind of man he is or the kind of involvement he is. And I think that's a mistake, as it would be with a mother or any other caregiver. So I want to draw some attention, some evidence that men are not necessarily unmitigated goods for their children. I also want to raise the notion that men may be doing something especially influential with regard to children's development that most developmental scientists don't think about, because they see the world through what I would call mental health lenses, well-being lenses, and not the lenses I like to look through with evolutionary biological lenses, because from an evolutionary biological worldview, what you appreciate is that all living things on this planet share a common mission. And that's to make other living things, to pass on their genetic material. That might not be the meaning of life, but that is, by definition, the purpose of life. That's what all living things are designed to do. That's why flies have wings. That's why we're bipedal, because these things help serve those ends directly and indirectly. And if we lose sight of those biological evolutionary foundations of living things and think of ourselves as somehow different rather than have so much in common with all of the living things, I think we miss something about human development. And finally, no matter what we claim about children being influenced by mothers, by fathers, by marriages, by teachers, it's becoming ever more apparent that that's not entirely so. That is, children look like the rest of us. They vary in their susceptibility to environmental influences, as I hope to show. Okay. Men in children's lives are not an unmitigated good. And again, I don't want anybody leaving this audience, leaving this conference, leaving this evening thinking men are bad for children in general. That's not my point. I'm qualifying the notion that men are good for children. Many presume, perhaps not unreasonably, that having a man in the home and thus two parents, a mother and father, is, quote, in the child's best interest. And that this is especially so when fathers are involved in the care of their children. Quite a few years ago now, Sarah Jaffes and her colleagues were studying more than 1,000 twin pairs and their parents in the UK and wanted to illuminate and address this issue. Is this really true that fathers are good for their children's development? Or really, under what conditions is that true, and under what conditions is it not so? So they hypothesized two things mattered, and these won't be surprising. The first was exposure to the father. Is he there? And so they're interested in the degree to which fathers are resident or not resident, absent or present, just physically living in the home. But also, what about the father's antisocial behavior? Some men are not the most kind, courteous, caring, considerate, agreeable people. In the same way that some women are not, might be the opposite of that there's variation, and we have to appreciate that variation. So Jaffes and her colleagues predicted that the longer highly antisocial men live with their children, the more antisocial would their children become, which is not unlike the data that Gary called attention to, which is what the role of violence in your childhood, how that plays when you become a violent man too. That's the intergenerational transmission of antisocial behavior. But that it would be different for children who didn't grow up with a violent father. And here are the results of their study, which you might consider as the cost and benefits of father's presence across the first 5 years of life. And so they looked at some fathers who were high in antisocial behavior, some fathers who were low in antisocial behavior, some fathers who fell in between in their antisocial behavior, and examined, were they never present, present about half the time, present all the time across the child's first 5 years, and then the child's antisocial behavior. And lo and behold, as you can see, that the more fathers involved, the less antisocial behavior children manifest if their fathers aren't highly antisocial. But if their fathers are highly antisocial, it is not in the best interest to have the father around, at least with regard to the development of the child's antisocial behavior. Now, but is it the father's presence or is it his actual involvement that mattered? And this is obviously a distinction that Gary was highlighting, the importance of men involved in caregiving. And lo and behold, the data look exactly the same, because these two things aren't unrelated, when you look at father involvement. Was father's caretaking, was the father never involved in caretaking? Was he involved on a monthly basis, or was he daily involved? And again, you're looking at children's antisocial behavior. And again, for the children whose dads were not highly antisocial, the more he was involved in caregiving, the less antisocial he was. This is exactly what Gary was pointing out at a geopolitical level, and this is within a single country. However, and we can't lose sight of this, for those dads who are highly antisocial, involvement was not in the child's best interest. Again, if we think antisocial behavior is not in the child's best interest. The bottom line here is we need to discriminate between the men who are a benefit to their children and the men who are unlikely to be a benefit to the children. Thankfully, the latter are the exception, but not the rule, but they're there. And in fact, they may be the ones who are generating more and more social dysfunction than anybody else, because it's their children, it looks like, who are at the biggest risk of growing up to be antisocial, not only to their own children as fathers, but to the rest of us as citizens in a society. Okay, so the moral of the story is, in general, in average, for most of us, men's involvement, his presence and his involvement is good, but not for everybody. Not in all cases. Okay, issue number 2. Fathers may affect children's development in ways not fully appreciated. Gary's list of things listed school achievement, social competence, emotional availability, your own capacity to be a father. And these are things that we as mental health thinkers think about as what we want our children to develop into. One of the consequences of having a mental health worldview is that there's optimal development and there's non-optimal development. There's a good way to be and there's a bad way to be. And don't get me wrong, even I'm going to challenge that idea. I like the good way to be. I prefer the good way to be. I value the good way to be. But I'm going to make an argument that nature doesn't necessarily value what we value. And nature has designed human development in such a way that if life isn't pleasant, if life is harsh, if life is uncomfortable, if life is challenging, if life is telling you that the future is uncertain, that caring is unavailable, that your safety and security is precarious, then growing up to be nice and sweet and lovely and caring may not make a whole lot of sense. And that under those more adverse conditions, there are other ways that perhaps you, quote, should be growing up. Because those other ways, at least in the historical past, maybe even still in the historical present, are better chances of passing your genes on to future generations. And this kind of thinking led me to advance or develop a theory of the development of reproductive strategies. And if we think about reproductive strategies here, I'm talking about whether you're inclined to defer sexual activity, establish long-term and enduring pair bonds, and invest heavily in your own children, things we value, versus initiating sex earlier, engaging in short-term unstable relationships, and not investing very heavily in the parenting role. Now, the presumption generally is that these are good and these are bad, these are healthy and these are not. The alternative theory is that these make a lot of sense under certain conditions. And in fact, we can talk about this as a fast reproductive strategy, because when there's high marital discord, there's high stress, there's inadequate resources, there's neighborhood violence. What do we see? We see that parenting becomes harsh, rejecting, insensitive, inconsistent, or neglectful. What is that doing? I would say that's sending a message to the child, maybe wisely, that the world is precarious, your life is precarious, you don't feel safe and secure. And children, as a consequence, so theory goes, and none of this is news, this is all common developmental psychology, that under these conditions, we develop insecure attachments. Relatedly, we develop mistrustful internal working models. We expect the worst out of others. We think the world is a cold and nasty place. We become opportunistic, interpersonally oriented advantage takers. Take rather than give. Hit first and ask questions later. In contrast, under good family context conditions, we parent in sensitive, supportive, responsive, and positively affectionate ways. In general, then, kids develop in the opposite way: secure attachment, trusting internal working models, and interpersonal orientations that are about reciprocal, rewarding exchanges. You give and you take. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that this kind of pathway leads to this kind of thing I want to call a reproductive strategy. But why is this different than typical, normal mental health theory? Because of an unusual prediction I advanced back in 1991 when I took off my mental health lenses and put on my evolutionary biological glasses. And that is the hypothesis that this process is actually going to speed up physical development. It's going to make children mature faster. The thinking is that you grow up in a world that's risky, precarious, that's sending you messages that you may not live long enough to breed. So what do? You go to seed early. You mature faster. And then, in consequence, you engage in more opportunistic sex. You're going for quantity of offspring, not quality of offspring. And in fact, as I'll show you shortly, there's more and more evidence consistent with this. And I would argue that there is no prevailing non-evolutionary psychological theory, attachment theory, social learning theory, life course sociology theory, psychodynamic theory, whatever theory you want to pull, developmental systems theories, none of those theories would anticipate the hypothesis that these developmental experiences are going to shape pubertal development. And none of these theories can explain it. Only a theory that begins by saying we are like all other living things on this planet. We have a fundamental goal and purpose, which is to replicate and reproduce. Even if we all don't do it, that is still what living things are designed to do. And so the first piece of work that I conducted with some colleagues was published back in 1992 to test this hypothesis using a large New Zealand database. And what did we find? We found, lo and behold, that when girls, and this theory turns out to hold for girls, when girls grew up in more conflicted families, when they grew up without fathers, they were achieving menarche. They were having their first period. They were becoming eventually fertile at a younger age. What was being regulated here was their reproductive development, not simply their psychological development, not simply their mental health. Now, one of the problems with studies like this, which is an observational study, is that we don't know if it's really an environmental influence of father absence or family conflict. It could be a common gene leading families to have conflict, leading fathers to be absent. Girls inherit it. It also leads them to mature earlier. Well, fortunately, Tither and Ellis came along a number of years later and said, we think we can get around that and test this idea more directly. And their idea was that let's look at sisters who grow up in intact families, and let's look at sisters who grow up in divorced families. Now, sisters who grow up in intact families both have long exposures to their dads. But sisters who grow up in divorced families have very different exposures to their dad. The older child has a longer exposure to his dad. The younger child has a shorter exposure to her dad. Therefore, what we should see, according to the theory and this situation, is that here in the divorced families, you should get a nice difference in terms of the age of menarche between these two sisters. Because the sister who's got a less exposure to her dad and more father absence exposure should be maturing at an earlier age than the older sister did who was exposed to the father. In contrast, over here, where the two sisters both have long-term exposure to their dads, there shouldn't be much difference. And lo and behold, that's exactly what they found. That if you look at the age of menarche of the older sister in the intact family, the younger sister in the intact family, and the older sister in the divorced family, there's no difference between those three. But they're all different from these girls, the younger sisters in the biologically broken family. Because these girls, unlike all the other girls, have had less exposure to their dad. And interestingly, when Tither and Ellis drilled down into these data a little more, what they found was what was really going on, this was especially the case if your dad was antisocial, bringing us back to the previous results. So it's having an antisocial dad who's not around very much, it turns out, is promoting earlier maturation. These girls are learning, or they're coming to understand, I don't mean they're coming to understand through their frontal lobes, their physiologies seem to be coming to understand that men are not trustworthy, they're not going to be around, you can't count on them, you got to go to seed early, become sexually active, have multiple offspring rather than a few, take care of them not intensely, and some will hopefully breed. Where in contrast, if you grow up in a situation where the world is a sense of control, a sense of love, a sense of caring, there's no rush to breed. Wait, find a good mate. You don't have to have as many kids. Over here, for these girls growing up under bad conditions, it may be that there's something in their minds that understands that to get 2 grandchildren, I may need 4 children or 5 children, because who knows what's going to happen to them. There's not a man around to bring in income. I'm chasing men all the time to have relations with them. We're here to get 2 grandchildren. I only need 2 kids, because I have confidence that my husband and I, the man in my life, that we can protect them and care for them. It's almost like for them we have a nice yolk sac around that egg. So there are lots of nutrients, economic, social, educational, nutritional, etc. Where here, there aren't many. So I want you to think about fathers not just as caregivers, not just as men who are there helping mental health, but they and the conflicts they create, or their absence, or their troubled relationships with their daughters at least, seems to be regulating reproduction. That is not the way we typically think of father influence. Okay, But now I want to challenge everything I've said. And I want to therefore also challenge some of what Gary said. Because implicit in everything I've said so far, and in what Gary said, and in what most of us think about who think about the early years, is the presumption that these things we're talking about, father involvement, mother involvement, good marriages, whatever it is, affect all children pretty much the same. I want to make the argument that that doesn't make any biological sense for this reason. The future is inherently uncertain. Why do we think, as I've just argued, that growing up in a coercive, nasty world leads to that advantage-taking orientation? Why do we think that growing up in a much more benign, if not nurturing and caring world leads to a much more caring, reciprocally rewarding, pro-social orientation? We think that makes sense because these experiences early in life are giving the child, if you would, a weather forecast of what tomorrow will be like, and therefore is preparation for tomorrow. And this preparation makes sense in this ecological niche, and this preparation makes sense in this ecological niche. And it does, up to a point. But the future is inherently uncertain. So that's not always going to be the case. If I'm prepared for this niche, and excuse the expression, the world goes to hell in a handbasket, then I'm misfit or mismatched for tomorrow. And by the same token, if I grow up in this niche, developmentally prepared for it to continue, and the world turns out much more sunny and rosy than it might otherwise be, then I also am mismatched. And because the future is uncertain, my argument was, theoretically, we should see variation in developmental plasticity, that some children should be more susceptible to these influences than should others. That some are basically making bets on tomorrow and say, I'm going to be like this, or I'm going to be like that, or I'm going to be like that, or I'm going to be like that. And it really doesn't matter what happens to me. That's just the track I'm going to stay on. In contrast, others are playing the game that the information I get from my experiences is sound and should regulate how I develop. In other words, theoretically, we should have some who are more responsive to their environmental inputs and some who are less responsive to their environmental inputs. And what I want to show you now is there seems to be ever more evidence that that's the case. In fact, what's so intriguing, it looks like the very factors that make individuals more and less developmentally plastic or malleable or susceptible to environmental influences, which is why I talk about differential susceptibility, those very factors that make one more sensitive to the environment does so for better and for worse. That is to say, those who are more sensitive, if they grow up under bad conditions, they go this way. But if they grow up under good conditions, they go this way. In fact, they benefit more from good conditions than do others. They suffer more from bad conditions than do others. The interesting implication of this is that those children we think about as resilient, not adversely affected by bad things, and we know there are children who grow up in poverty, there are children who grow up with alcoholic fathers, there are children who grow up with abusive fathers, there are children who grow up with depressed mothers, there are children who grow up in dangerous neighborhoods who turn out just fine. It turns out those children who are well buffered and protected and resilient in the face of adversity, it looks like they don't benefit in the face of support and enrichment, or at least not to the extent that others do. So being resilient in the face of adversity also isn't an unmitigated good, because if, lo and behold, you're transported into a nurturant environment, it looks like you just stay the person you are. And you know what? We already know this in some level. We've all heard stories about people who grow up under bad conditions and turn out fine. By the same token, we know about people who grow up under good conditions and turn out terrible. It's almost like those characters were scripted in them and what was going on around them didn't matter. So let's quickly look at some research consistent with this. Here's work looking at maternal positive and negative parenting that ranges from more negative here to less negative here, or less positive here to more positive here, and how it relates to children's IQ or children's externalizing problems, i.e. their aggression and disobedience. And what it looks like, surprisingly, is that it's highly negatively emotional at 9 months of age, infants who are the most malleable for better and for worse. That is, for those who score low in negative emotion or not very distressed as 9-month-olds, whether they get more negative parenting or less negative parenting makes no difference. That's a functional flat line to their externalizing behavior. The same is true for the effect of positive parenting, less positive, more positive, on their IQs. But look what happens to children who are highly negatively emotional as infants. Under negative parenting conditions, they show the most behavior problems. Under low negative parenting conditions, they show the least. Same thing here. Under low positive parenting, they show the lowest IQs. Under more positive parenting, they show the most. Here we have, let's move into more of a father-related realm, marital conflict, conflict between husband and wife, which is thought to be bad for children. Lo and behold, temperamental irritability once again moderates whether or not growing up in a low conflict home or a high conflict home is going to have an influence on behavior problems. The theory is that growing up in a high conflict marital environment is not good for you. But it looks like for kids who are low in temperamental irritability as young children, it makes no difference at all. It's a flat line. But for kids who are highly negatively emotional, it makes a big difference. Not surprisingly, under high conflict situations, these kids develop the most behavior problems. But what's so surprising is that under low conflict conditions, they develop the least behavior problems. We've often thought of being temperamentally irritable, being negatively emotional, having a difficult temperament as being, quote, a risk factor. Here it looks like, it's an opportunity factor. You're doing better under these conditions if you're irritable. Next slide. Showing the same thing again, this time looking at another, quote, plasticity factor, which is physiological reactivity. How much does your physiology respond to stressful situations? And it turns out, surprisingly again, that the highly physiologically reactive are the ones who are most sensitive to their environments for better and for worse. We can see here those who have low physiological reactivity, the yellow line, when they grow up under high conflict marriages or low conflict marriages, has no effect on their externalizing behavior problems. But for those who are highly physiologically reactive, growing up under high conflict, as expected, leads to lots of behavior problems. But once again, if you're blessed with a low conflict situation, you have the least behavior problems. Here we see the same thing with regard to the quality of childcare that children experience. And once again, it's the highly negative who are affected for better and for worse, such that these are high negative emotional 3- and 6-month-olds. When they were exposed to low quality childcare, they showed the most behavior problems by the time they got to kindergarten. But if they had high quality childcare, they showed the least behavior problems. In contrast, the other children who were low in negativity, the quality of childcare doesn't matter. What's so fascinating about these data in particular is when they were first analyzed, the observation was that quality doesn't matter for the development of problem behavior. Why? Because these two lines were averaged. And when you average them, you didn't get an effect. But if you sorted them on a factor that you had reason to believe now might distinguish the more responsive, the more sensitive, the more susceptible from the less, that is, their negative emotionality, all of a sudden the Red Sea parts, and you can see that some matter, that for some, the quality of childcare, like the quality of marriage, like parenting, makes a difference. And here we see the only study to my knowledge that gets at the issue of fathers. And here we're looking at change in paternal depression. For some dads, predicting internalizing. For some dads, depression went up. For some dads, depression went down across the period 18 to 54 months. Yep. And what we see is, for those kids who had high cortisol levels in the afternoon and the evening, they were affected by that change in depression. That if father's depression went up, they became more showed more problems themselves. If father's depression came down, reduced, they benefited. For the other kids who had low basal cortisol, it made no difference. And I can show you more slides, I don't have the time, showing that we can look at genetic factors in children that seem to make a difference too in identifying those who are more and less susceptible. The bottom line here is it looks like there's variation or individual differences in children's susceptibility to environmental influences. So whatever we think makes a difference in children's lives, it looks like that's both true and false. Unless you're talking about dropping kids off the 14th floor. That's going to matter to every kid. So there are some things that have been so disastrous that all will suffer. But beyond that, within the realm of everyday experience, it looks like for some, it's nature, probably more than nurture. For others, it's nurture more than nature. And this is very interesting and important when it comes to the notion of intervention. Gary was talking about they're doing interventions to promote fathering. My hypothesis for Gary is that it will work for some men and not for others. In the same way I could show you, we have a new generation of research showing that interventions long thought to be generally efficacious are not. And what makes a difference in whether they benefit the child or they don't? It looks like it's some of these plasticity factors that come out of these observational studies. And if we don't distinguish those who are more and less susceptible to fathering and lots of other things, we're going to misestimate what the benefits of these programs are. We're going to overestimate it for the ones who aren't very susceptible, and we're going to underestimate it for the ones who are susceptible. But this raises a real sensitive policy question. If we get to the point, I don't think we're there yet, that we can really identify kids, or fathers, or mothers, or whatever else, who are really sensitive to their environments, and others who aren't. Should we, if we're going to have a program or services or interventions, target the former first and foremost, rather than the latter? Because these ones are more likely to benefit and more likely to pay the cost if they don't get the service, where these ones are less likely to benefit? Now, some people don't like that idea. They think because they value equity. But other people, myself included, value efficacy. And I wonder, where is the ethics in providing services that aren't going to be effective, especially in a resource-limited world, at least so far, if that means denying services to those who are most likely to benefit from them. So we may come to a day and age, and I would say in 10 years we'll be there, where we will be struggling with this issue of, if we know these kids, because of their genetic or temperamental or physiological reasons, are very likely to prove responsive and benefit from this intervention. And on the same basis, we know these kids are much less likely, that we're going to say, let's get the bang for the buck. And let's intervene here first and foremost. And at the same time, let's then ask the question, is it the case that these kids are not responsive? Or is it they're just not responsive to what we're handing out? And maybe we have to try something radically different. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.